Let's get on to our main topic of the week. Obviously, in the news, quite a bit over the last couple of days is Ukraine and Russia. So the timeline, I guess the rough timeline, my understanding is that Zelensky's kind of making the rounds, the bully pulpit leader of Ukraine, advocating for Ukraine, and he had to come to America, I guess, under the auspices of like signing a deal or negotiating some sort of deal for minerals. But obviously, those talks kind of broke down because, well, from Zelensky's perspective, Trump was basically saying we want to have all these rights to like mineral resources and like access to mineral resources from Ukraine. But obviously, Trump wasn't really offering any security guarantees. Like from Ukraine's perspective, they want to be able to say like, look, we have like certain security guarantees, we have a pathway to NATO membership, EU membership, stuff like that. And Trump's just not willing to really guarantee any of that. If anything, it's the opposite, where Trump is saying we absolutely just like don't think that Ukraine realistically, I guess, could be part of NATO anytime soon. And these talks kind of broke down, and they had this press conference afterwards where they're sitting in the Oval Office. There's like 50 people in the office or something like that. You've got Zelensky and Trump in kind of the main seats, and you've got ambassadors and whatnot, JD Vance, all these other people sitting on the couches near, and reporters everywhere. And the news that was made was that Zelensky kind of got ran down by Trump and the right-wing media, where Trump was basically saying, you know, look, your negotiating position is terrible. You're gambling with World War III. JD Vance said, when's the last time that you said thank you, Mr. Zawinski? And that obviously got a lot of news. And then there was that one complete idiot right-wing reporter who was like, well, do you even own a suit, Mr. President of Ukraine? What the fuck? You know, I mean, that's the thing that we care about in the Trump administration is decorum, goddammit. And so this just made a lot of news and got a lot of people upset. Guys, what do we think about this, generally speaking? What do we think of the Trump deal? What do we think of how Trump is handling this? What do we think of the long-term implications of Ukraine, Russia, the relationship between America and Russia? Just give us your general thoughts. Whoever wants to start.
I mean, the first thing is just how vapid Vance's complaint was, right? Like it's literally about, oh, the stature you've given us in the White House. And the way that conservatives are talking about it is like, they've demeaned the United States before the world. This is a great crime against us. If Vance just didn't say anything and just shrugged and rolled off like he was like, just kept talking, having a normal conversation, it wouldn't have been a big deal whatsoever. Like they wanted this fight because Trump aligns with Russia. I don't know how else they can be more obvious. Like when he calls Zelensky a dictator, that's way worse than Zelensky being like, you are wrong on the facts. Like,
did he say that, SDL? I mean, Trump couldn't recall having said that.
He didn't remember. He said, did I say that? I don't think I said that.
I don't think he said that.
Funny.
If anybody
is Trump old, is he losing it? I don't know. I'm hearing sort of a Joe Biden track record here. Just saying.
If anybody read the transcript of that conversation, they would see very clearly that Zelensky is not the one who provoked that engagement, the negative one, because he was asked the passive-aggressive question earlier by the reporter about not wearing a suit. All he did was ask JD Vance what he meant by diplomacy, because JD Vance was saying that Zelensky should come to the table with Russia. And he was saying, what do you mean diplomacy, JD? We made a ceasefire agreement with them earlier and they broke it. So what do you mean by that? And then Zelensky then JD Vance just goes completely ballistic and crazy on him. And for some context, it's not like this is the first time JD Vance has done anything that indicates that he's not a big supporter of the Ukrainian cause. Directly after the war started, JD Vance said on a podcast that he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other. Period. He does not care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other. Trump has been very clear about his position on Putin from the very beginning. He said that he was going to end the war on day one, right? And that they've been complaining about how much money that we've been providing to Ukraine for a very long time. And so this is not a surprise. Now, but I think something that we should discuss is the ideology which motivates this. Obviously, there's the insanity, there's the personality politics of Trump just liking Putin a lot and not really liking Zelensky because of his first impeachment and all of that stuff. But also, the intellectuals on the right say, well, this is all part of a huge strategy to realign the United States with the real world power that can help them tackle China, Russia.
Yeah, that is genuinely hilarious because, again, I feel like people, and I don't know if I've gone on this rant on this show, but One of the problems that I think right wingers and people in general are having is they have this why in their head. Why is Trump doing this? What's the explanation? Oh, it's this ideological repositioning of America to tackle China in some sort of cohesive fashion. No, guys, that's nonsense. Trump doesn't think thoughts. He doesn't think thoughts, guys. Okay, this isn't. There's no great ideological motivations here. There's no like, oh, I have this sort of like principled or adherence to some rational thought as to why this is happening. The reason why this is happening is because Trump just likes Putin. That's it. Some people, I take the more radical stance. Even some people say Putin is blackmailing Trump. Putin has some sort of financial interest he's holding over Trump's head. I don't even think that's what's happening. I think Trump just likes Vladimir Putin. He's demonstrated his affinity towards dictators not only with Putin, but also with Orban, with Kim Jong-un, with even Xi Jinping, who he has this competition with. But he says, I respect Xi Jinping and I think he's a great leader, this and that. Like, he just likes Putin, and that's why this is happening. And maybe Micah's right that he took the, first impeachment personally, but it's just all personal politics with Trump. I think that's how I kind of view things. Maybe there's people around Trump that are kind of steering him in this direction or enabling him, but they might have their own more sophisticated reasons for doing this. But for Trump himself, he doesn't think thoughts, guys. It's very simple.
So I wanted to chart a middle course here. So I do think that Trump is very driven by personal emotions and personal profits. During his first term, there's decent evidence to believe that he was shifted towards being more pro-Russia because development in Russia was promised to him. Like, he'd be able to build a hotel with profit margins in Moscow, which is like the dumbest possible reason to change a geopolitical alliance. But I think around him, and possibly it's seeped into his head now, there is a plan among the right wing of the United States, especially the realists in the United States, to pivot away from opposing Russia and opposing China to supporting, allying with Russia even, to better contain China, which is seen as the real power. So probably the most prominent proponent of this is John Mearsheimer, who occasionally gets cited as like the realist who's willing to tell it how it is by people of every political persuasion who hate Ukraine, pretty much. His position is that, and I can quote from an article that he wrote just like 2 months ago on this, but he says Russia is not a threat. It's a has-been power. It doesn't realistically threaten the world. He says there's only 3 global powers, the United States, Russia, and China, and he thinks China is the real threat to the United States. So the United States should give Ukraine to Russia. It's its natural security interests. Of course, they want to take control of it. It's in their sphere of influence. Mearsheimer thinks all of that is justified and legitimate. And if it's not justified and legitimate, it's the only rational course of action if you really want to contain China. So in short, it's abandon Ukraine, sell out Ukraine, pivot everything to opposing China.
Right.
Yeah.
And to me, I think this idea is a bit preposterous because there's a notion here that first, okay, let's say we don't care about democracy or people in other countries. We only care about our own geopolitical interests, right? So we don't care about whether Ukraine loses their democracy or Russia meddles in all these countries and overthrows their liberal freedom. So let's say we get rid of all of that and we say all we care about is America's national interest. What is the ideal situation for America? Basically, all the other countries in the world are second fiddle to us. They do what we want. We can get the best trade deals. We can extradite any criminals that come here. We can get favorable agreements insofar that we can get anything from other countries. We can get it from all these other countries. That is the relationship we currently have with Europe. That is the relationship we have with all the NATO states, all the democracies that he's been attacking. If we have criminals that we want, they can give it to us. If we want to really strike a hard bargain on trade agreements, we can get it from them. We have tremendous amounts of power over them. They are part of our alliance, NATO, that we lead. Whenever we declare war on another country, even if we're completely wrong, like we declared war on Afghanistan, maybe that was a little bit reasonable. We declared war on Iraq. What the hell? They bomb those countries with us. They just do what we want. Okay. So that's the idea. We want that for every country on earth, right? That's part of the reason why we don't like China, because we can't boss them around. And actually, they're taking countries off the map into their realm and not our realm, okay? Why the hell would we trade NATO, all of Europe, for freaking Russia? You're gonna trade probably the most powerful collective economy in the world, some of the most powerful countries in the world, for some backwater tyranny autocracy, which isn't going to be loyal to you, isn't going to bow down to what you want. It has the economy as an economy the size of like one European country, like France. Seriously? What kind of trade is that? And also, what are they going to do to actually fight with China? Because for Russia, all of their actual potential for expansion comes from the bordering states that used to be incorporated within them. It comes from Kazakhstan. It comes from Georgia. All these countries, not China. What lands do they want from China? Are they really going to go fight with them over some skirmishes over some tiny border regions? That's what they're going to focus on with a country that they know they'll lose a war against? I think it's completely insane.
So to both undermine and steelman Mearsheimer's argument a bit, I think the simplest error in his thinking is this idea that there's only 3 global powers and that the list goes United States, China, and then a distant third, Russia. Like, no, insofar as you think of the countries of Europe as a collective entity, which is somewhat questionable, but insofar as you think of them as a collective entity, that power is far above Russia in terms of economic power, innovative power, basically any kind of power you want, even soft power, right? Like there's way more culture coming out of Europe than there is out of Russia. So just from a realist perspective, I think ignoring Europe is really stupid. If you have to lose, if you lose 10 points of like strength of relationship with Europe to gain 10 points, 20 points, 30 points with Russia, it's just not worth it. Like the conversion rate there is really low because Russia is naturally disinclined to support you. So it's really hard to get them on your side. And what they bring to the table is really weak. So it frustrates me even from a realist perspective. I think this sounds ridiculous. In fact, Mearsheimer himself, I will just give, and this is sort of steelmanning Mearsheimer a bit, he said that Trump's actions right now are not simply disruptive, but destructive. He doesn't think that Trump is playing the game accurately, which might lean towards Econoboy's point, that Trump isn't playing the game that the right-wing realists want of ally with Russia, don't piss off your European allies, pivot everyone against China. That's what Mearsheimer wants. But Trump is just pissing off all of our allies and allying with Russia and sort of failing to execute the pivot to China. So Mearsheimer doesn't even like what Trump is doing. And that, I think, speaks to maybe Trump just personally likes Putin and he doesn't like the Democratic leaders.
True.
Yeah,
True.
I think to kind of put that in a single sentence, I think that the problem with that logic of like, let's team up with Russia to fuck China over is that, number one, obviously, we're assuming that would even work, right? Like Russia and China have this like very long-standing sort of anti-Western alignment. So it's very hard to say if you could really gain that much, like to totally, cause another schism between Russia and China would be kind of a tough assumption. But then also you're sacrificing your relationship with your already more powerful ally, which is the EU and the broader Western kind of coalition, including like Australia and New Zealand and, maybe South Africa, just like all these other countries as well, by aligning yourself with Russia. And it's just, strictly speaking, that calculus just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I think especially we have to also ask, like, I mean, how relevant would that even be when it came to a conflict with, like, what are you realistically going to get out of Russia? Like, if China invades Taiwan, what do you like if you gave Russia Ukraine and just said you can annex Ukraine, you can just have it, and then China invades Taiwan, like, are we expecting Russia to send troops to like Taiwan to help like what
I think so. I'll do the steelman bits because we're all sort of in agreement. I think the steelman would be that Russia controls a decent amount of natural resources which feed into China.
Right.
Insofar as Russia might be willing to slow or reduce those during a war, it would hurt China's ability. But in the specific scenario of invading Taiwan, it feels like that's going to be all or nothing. Like they're just going to get it and they're going to have enough to do it in the first push. It's not going to rely on like factory production a year down the line of bullets that are going to a stockpile that's running out. Like, so I find the argument that you get this huge strategic gain just not very compelling. Like even on realist grounds,
probabilistically, it would just be very difficult to imagine as well.
There's a slight problem with the theory that Trump's motivated by this, other than the fact that even Mearsheimer and everybody else realizes the way that he's handling this is at least suboptimal. They also don't seem to really care about fighting with China. Like Trump has had a bunch of comments which are relatively off color, like, hey, we actually want to strike a deal with you guys. He tariffed Taiwan. Why would you tariff Taiwan? it doesn't seem like JD Vance is very interested at all in defending Taiwan. I mean, it's basically the same logic of defending Taiwan from China as defending Ukraine from Russia. Now, we've said all this from a realist perspective. I don't think we actually are realists. In the wonks here are not realists in the sense that we actually do care about people who do not live in the United States, right? Like I care about people everywhere in the world, and I want them to live in functional, prosperous, free societies where they have a say in who governs them. And that means that even if Europe and Russia were equal in power, or Russia was slightly more powerful than Europe, I would still prefer European powers like Ukraine, which are much more democratic and free and liberal, over the authoritarian autocracy, which is Russia.
Just to add two things to this, I do agree that if Trump is meaning to compete with China, he's undercutting himself in a lot of other ways. So the destruction of USAID is idiotic from the perspective of trying to win over sub-Saharan African nations, Southeast Asian nations through the cause of the United States. You're giving a ton of money, saving a ton of lives, improving economic opportunity, and labeling it with the US flag. And pulling that back so loudly is like a slap. Americans complain that Zelensky like slapped in the face of Trump or whatever by being insufficiently polite. Imagine what this says to every African ally, that you're willing to cut funding keeping people in their countries alive just because you want to save like $40 billion, like less than 0.5% of the federal budget. The second thing is just like on, the other thing would be like scientific competition. Like he's gutting the DOE, he's gutting basic science funding, he's gutting all these things where how is China actually going to outcompete the United States? If it does, it's going to be through scientific breakthroughs. China has excellent STEM programs. They graduate about 2.5 to 3 times more people per year than we do. Even if those people are graduating a lower level of quality, so to speak, it doesn't really matter if they got a lot more of them. And so like unironically, when you talk to people in the DOE, in the basic science space about how you'd want to compete with China, it's like graduate a bunch more STEM people, go to free college, go free STEM degrees, ton of basic research funding, and they're going the exact opposite direction. So I tend to think that the evidence on that leans more towards Trump just wanting to tear up the administrative state than thinking about this gigantic realist fight against China. One last note on this. This is sort of a pedantic one, but to Micah, I think there's a meaningful difference between what you might call descriptive realism, which is the argument that countries, whatever they say, actually do follow their national self-interest all the time. That's sort of the realist position, that no matter what the country says they're doing, like, oh, the United States wants to promote democracy. No, it's actually just promoting its national self-interest. Versus like prescriptive realism, which is the argument that we should follow realist rules. So that's the only distinction.
The idea of if you are a descriptive realist, but not a prescriptive realist, then what you're saying is we actually should not act in accordance to our self-interest, which I think presumes the possibility that it's possible for a nation not to act in its own self-interest.
I do think it's very hard. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you. Like you have to argue that some countries, and to be blunt, realism is false. No country truly acts in its national self-interest because that thing doesn't exist. This is something that a lot of more modern IR theories get into, that nations are composed of a lot of people who have a lot of different perspectives. They're heterogeneous. There's national interests, so to speak.
Right. Like the problem with these theories is, first, even if you're pursuing your own national interest, there's huge disagreements within a country about what that entails, right? So you could still have different foreign policies. But second of all, nations are led by individuals, not monoliths that act in the collective interest of the population. Like the government doesn't do what's optimal for the population in domestic policy or foreign policy. Like George Bush, I honestly think part of the reason why he invaded Iraq was for a political calculation that it was going to be advantageous to him, right? Because his polling went up after the war in Afghanistan started. And his father invaded Iraq, and actually that was quite good for him politically. So sometimes politicians are governed by their own self-interest. Oh my God, that's crazy. Sometimes people are grasped by ideologies. They're motivated to fulfill certain ambitions. I think U.S. foreign policy, insofar that we've done some pretty decent things in the past, has been motivated by actual internationalist ideas of like, hey, we actually want to help people. You look at many of the people who work in the State Department and Foreign Service, these are people that are very well educated, that are very altruistic, that have worked their entire life to get to these top positions because they genuinely want to make the world a better place. right? And it's hard to think that those people, unbeknownst to themselves, are actually secretly always motivated by maximizing the national interest, whatever it is, of the United States.
So this, to get into the terminology weeds a bit, this is sort of getting more towards constructivist IR, which argues the sort of stuff I was talking about, that like national interest doesn't really exist. There's a bunch of people's interests that hold the levers of power. And sort of in the aggregate or in a sum of individual decisions, that sort of works out as what a nation is doing. But each nation is constructed differently, and its goals act differently based on who gets into power. So with Trump, you're seeing the great example of this, where suddenly the levers of power all shift another direction just because of who controls it, rather than a fundamental shift in like the national interest of the American people. We did not shift, on January 20th from being like pro, like Ukraine good because we like democracy, to Ukraine bad because we like Putin. As the national interest, the people holding the levers of power did.
Well, this is why I actually love that you bring up this point, because if you believe that realism was really just fully true, you're like orthodox realist, then foreign policy shouldn't just be changing with elections. Like, and I understand why people subscribe to this theory probably earlier, like back whenever U.S. foreign policy was a lot more consistent amongst the two parties. But nowadays, it's like, you can't have your entire foreign policy switch on a dime and be like, well, all of this is just the national interest. And for some reason, as soon as Trump came into office, what was best for the United States just seems to have completely changed.
Now, I will offer the defense of realism. I think there's a way you can have a constructive realism, which is the argument that most people tend to act in ways that are pro-social, but most pro-social for the people closest to them. So they tend to benefit their families, their country, before they benefit further and further people from them, like other countries. And so that's absolutely true. Like most nations throughout history are selfish. Most nations are trying to benefit themselves. Just to speak a little bit, like in very recent history, the United States, despite having a bunch of fairly altruistic people in the State Department, I'm sure, has also like we've overseen the Yemeni like starvation and genocide. We've overseen the potential ethnic cleansing of Palestine, like the temporary and then potentially not, and then potentially back on again ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and deaths of like 50,000 people.
But I think a lot of this is motivated by ideology. Like, at least during the Cold War, I think a lot of the coups that you saw, like the coup in Indonesia, was motivated by the ideology that like communism must be destroyed everywhere. Yeah. I don't know if it was optimal from their perspective for the United States. I think Chinese foreign policy, and kind of by give you a word in a second. I think China's current foreign policy shows a lot more political motivations than national interest maximization. I think, why are they so adamant on taking Taiwan? It's actually really bad for them to take Taiwan, just because all the sanctions, like all of this work and all these subsidies they've had to do just to make it where their economy could survive attacking Taiwan, right? This doesn't really make sense from a national interest perspective, but it does make sense from a political and ideological perspective. There's all these ideological motivations for why they want to take Taiwan. And the people in power in China understand that they have to stay in power, right? And one way is to grow. They've had a growth consensus for a long time where it's going to grow the economy a lot. People will like the CCP. Now growth is slowing down. Demographic changes are not really positive for them. And so I think part of their idea is, well, we need to have a foreign enemy now. We're going to pivot to kind of like more of a nationalist pitch to the population, and that requires somebody that you're going to fight with, right? And I think Taiwan is the perfect person for them to pick a fight with.
To speak to that a tiny bit, I definitely think that shift has occurred among Chinese leadership. Whether that's sort of an intentional strategy to win popularity or just due to shifts of the opinions of Chinese leadership, it's harder to say. Like I would say the same thing for the United States. Like, is Donald Trump doing the things with Russia because he thinks it's popularity maximizing, or because he personally likes it, or because he wants some sort of shift of global alliances? It's always a mixture. And I will just note that, like, so far, China's foreign policy has been relatively much, like, in the past 40 years, China's foreign policy has been far less aggressive than the United States. One of the sort of open questions, at least as I recall it, like 10 years ago, is China's posturing on Taiwan just posturing? Is it just a way to, as you say, Micah, drive up popularity by doing national sentiment, like banging the chest? We're going to take back Taiwan. We're going to unify the Chinese people. You get to do sort of like light racism stuff. And the people love it. just like they do in the United States, apparently. But then you're not actually going to do it because it's an idiotic move. Like that's sort of the question. And it does seem like they're moving more and more towards actually preparing to invade Taiwan. So that's sort of worrying. But I remember that being an open question like 5-10 years ago. It seems like it's getting less and less open as China continues to build more missiles, continues to build more, basically more platforms designed specifically to attack, surround Taiwan. So
yeah, it feels like dark times are potentially ahead for Taiwan. I don't really know what that'll look like. I sure hope that if China invades Taiwan, it doesn't do so under the Trump administration, because I can only imagine how terrible just how poorly thought out and terrible the American response would be.
If there even is one, like
Yeah.
the U.S. hasn't even formally committed itself to defending Taiwan under Dem administrations or like more standard neoconservative Republican administrations. Trump is terrifying Taiwan.
Well,
Like
I mean,
I don't
that's in
know.
part because America, they have this incoherent nonsense one China policy where it's like they have to play pretend that basically Taiwan is actually, there's only one China. It's still technically part of Taiwan's still technically part of China, which is, I've always found it to be just amongst the most ridiculous foreign policy stances that America has. I mean, I understand that there's some functional reasons for it, but at the same time, like to SDL's point, it puts you in this awkward position of like, what do you mean if China invades Taiwan? Like, it's one China policy. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what are we going to invade Texas? How does that work? Right. I mean, it's just kind of this bizarre thing. And so obviously, I could see like an invasion of Taiwan going a couple of different ways under Trump, where like you could imagine that the anti-China sentiment in the administration is just like so high that actually Trump responds to the Taiwanese invasion really well. Right, like, oh, full military aid, full military response, embargo China, international coalition. Like, you could totally see Trump doing that. Or you could see Trump just being a dumb fuck and being influenced by like these weird, like, kind of like, I don't know, just like these like very, very like anti-war, like isolationist conservatives who are like, no, like fuck those, Taiwanese people. Who gives a shit? Like they're part of China anyway, right? Like let's just let them do whatever they want. That's not our business. And it's kind of very difficult to imagine
I
how
think
Trump
there's
would
a
respond.
I think there's a 100% chance that if Taiwan is invaded, Trump does not rush to their defense. I don't think that I think there's a misconception that maybe it's a holdover from the first Trump term that Trump is a China hawk. He's not a China hawk, not at least now. I don't think that he cares. I think Trump is ultimately a nationalist and an isolationist, and he really likes to make deals, and including with the Chinese. I don't think he wants to fight with anybody. And I don't think that he's going to be very enthusiastic to flex his muscles to defend Taiwan. I don't think he cares about Taiwan at all.
Yeah, I think that's probably more likely. But it's difficult to say, right? Because like I could totally imagine a scenario where like China invades Taiwan and Trump does this, like Trump understands that he could have like a Bush level approval rating by, bringing the country together. We're going to defend Taiwan. And like I could see him having an approval rating of like 75% if he does
Wait,
something
wow.
like that, right?
Wait,
Well,
but like
because
like
people don't
defending
people
Ukraine wasn't that popular.
well, America didn't commit actual troops to, Ukraine. It wasn't really America's war
I
in
mean,
any sort of formal sense, right? So,
defending Ukraine is still actually fairly popular. I want to say even among Republicans, it polls like plus 20 or something. I know very recently, like after a certain meeting at the White House, it seems to have dipped quite a bit. But it was very popular for a very long time, despite people like Trump sort of shitting on it.
Well, it was popular on paper, but it wasn't like, oh my God, Biden is now super popular because we're supporting Ukraine.
I mean,
because
we can
that
talk for a
wasn't
million years about how the translation of popular opinion doesn't work into voters. Like,
I think we could also imagine like it's two different bases of people, right, Michael? Like I think that I could totally see the MAGA base being like, yeah, like fuck China, we're all these made in China products, we're buying them and burning them immediately. Like, all of a sudden he has like a literally 100% approval rating for all Republicans. But then there is a portion of like the Democratic and independent base of people where they would see like that national patriotism and they would be grabbed by it, right? Not necessarily exactly similar to Bush during 9/11 because America was directly attacked themselves, right? But I could just imagine that being kind of like a popularity getter on net for Trump. But nonetheless, I think that your theory that Trump is probably not going to give that much of a shit about Taiwan being invaded is probably true. I mean, like you said, right? I mean, why would you be tariffing semiconductors from Taiwan? It's not clear that the security commitments from America are like that strong. And so I could see China saying, well, hey, like we should probably invade Taiwan in the next, 1 to 2 years or something, while Trump is in office, because we assume the response will be so incompetent relative to like a Democratic administration. But I don't know, that's kind of off kilter from the Ukraine Russia conflict. The last thing I wanted to ask about the Ukraine Russia conflict is, you know, what really should America be doing in this regard, right? Like, obviously, what Trump is doing is probably not optimal, but, what should the response from America be in this conflict overall? STL, Michael, what do you guys think? I guess I can go first. I mean, my general thought is that I don't really see a path for Ukraine to get back Crimea or their eastern territories anytime soon. It just seems like the war fronts are very entrenched on both sides. And despite like hundreds of billions of dollars of international investments, I mean, what we've kind of ended up with in Ukraine is this kind of stalemate on both sides. Now, that's not to say that we should just completely give up, on funding Ukraine, kind of like Trump is signaling that we should do. But I think that at a certain point, what's more realistic, right? Like Ukraine actually capturing back all of their territory and having this kind of glorious moment against a backdrop of wavering Western support. Or is there probably going to be some peace deal at some point where Ukraine probably gives up a lot of territory in exchange for some Western security guarantees, like maybe a pathway to NATO and EU membership, something like that. Like it seems like the latter is just more likely given how kind of static the war effort is on both sides and how wavering the Western support is. So, I mean, that's just kind of my thought. I think that ultimately, though, Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership, they have to be the ones to make that decision for themselves. I mean, if Ukraine says, look, we want to fight until the very last man and we want to just keep fighting forever until we get all of our territory back. I mean, okay. I mean, that's their choice to make, but just like from my perspective, it seems like, I don't know. The prospect of like a fairy tale sort of ending to this conflict seems very, very, very far fetched. What do you guys think?
Sure. So, I mean, my position was that the United States should support Ukraine, that it is a relatively democratic country that's under invasion by another country. It makes sense to try and support those, like insofar as that is a genuinely internationalist, like rule-based international order type position. I think it's very hard not to take that type approach. It's better to live in a world where you can't invade other countries, especially other democratic countries, for no goddamn reason. Like if you listen to the things Putin was saying when he was invading, he talked about Ukrainians and Russians being one people bound by 1,000 years of shared history. He talked about how there was a genocide going on in eastern Ukraine, which wasn't happening. There were 25 deaths from conflict in the previous year in eastern Ukraine. So he was just lying. Like he's insane. He's lying, invading a democratic country for clearly nationalist reasons. So
Oh no, we lost SDL for the second time on Restream, guys. Unbelievable. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that obviously America should support Ukraine to the end if that's really what they and their leadership want. But I just think that thinking totally realistically, I find maybe a military expert could explain this better to me. Like the path by which we would imagine Ukraine recapturing all of their territories, like that seems like a very fanciful idea. STL, you got interrupted midway through your point. What were you saying?
I was trying to say something similar, that there was a period around mid-2024 where Ukraine retook all of its Western territories and where the movement on the East started to be about 100 square kilometers per week, per month, per whatever. It was completely entrenched. There was very little movement. And what little movement there was pro-Russian. Russia slowly advanced on net from late 2024 onward. And I got a little shit for it. I said, this is probably the time to sue for peace. You're not moving. A lot of people are dying. There's a lot of people displaced. This is like a real harm to both Ukraine, Russia, and the world economy for everyone to continue this war if it's not going to resolve the territorial disputes through some sort of like total victory for one side. And people hated on me for that. And I think some of it was the argument, well, if the US had sent aid earlier, we may have been able to take the territories. I think that's correct, but we didn't. And so we live in a world where there was basically no way for Ukraine to even take the Eastern territories, let alone Crimea. Like, I don't know that Crimea was ever in the cards ever, but the Eastern territories were not getting retaken. It's not even like right now Ukraine is advancing. Russia has been advancing slowly and slowly. So I
mean, ultimately it seems like it would take like actual ground efforts from EU and American kind of military alliances to fully kick Russia out of Ukraine. And I don't think that doesn't even seem to be even conceivably within the cards. Micah, it sounds like you have something to say. Go for it.
I do have something to say. So I think obviously the right way to handle this earlier was to be a lot stronger on Russia. Biden slow walked a lot of aid. We could have put them in a better bargaining position by just going really hard and then trying to strike a deal. Now we're in a worse position. I think that we want to bargain this in a way that's as favorable to Ukraine as possible while ending the war. And if Trump was consistent with his brand of being a guy who really strikes a hard bargain by demanding a lot and going really hard, this is what he would have done. And this would have been the right thing to do. He would have said, we're going to like quadruple our aid to Ukraine. Like, we are going to give them everything they could possibly ask for. We're going to put all the pressure in the universe on Europe to give them everything they could possibly ask for. We're going to put as much more sanctions. We're going to sanction everything. We're going to try to strike a deal with China so that they put sanctions on Russia. We're going to threaten you so hard. And you can stop all of this by taking a deal. What's the deal? Okay, well, what do you start with? You say, we're going to take this territory. You basically say, like, hey, some of the territory you own right now, you're going to have to get back to Ukraine, but you can keep the rest. We'll internationally recognize that. We're going to put them in NATO. What are they going to say? They're going to say, F that. They come to the table. Eventually, we strike a deal where Ukraine probably gets a little bit of territory back. They get a bunch of security guarantees, so they're not in NATO, but they basically are, right? And they get a bunch of assistance. And then Putin gets to say he got a victory, and we get the best deal possible for Ukraine. But unfortunately, Trump views Ukraine as the issue to peace. Like, we need to put as much pressure on them as possible to accept the worst possible deal, right? Which has given Russia the ability to probably get a lot more than it would have gotten otherwise.
Well, it's not just that. Like, it's the security guarantees are certainly the biggest portion of this, right? It's like, you can't just, you're like, why would Ukraine ever sign it? Why would they agree to sign a deal? Or, like, at the very least, why would leadership in Ukraine ever agree to sign a deal where it's like, yeah, we give up a lot of our mineral resources, we give up a lot of our territory, maybe more than what Russia's currently occupying. And I guess in T-minus 2 years, they'll just invade us again. Like, what the fuck? What would be the point of that? Like, that's obviously, that's like that's just an unworkable deal at that point, right? Like, you have to actually, pathway to NATO membership or some like very substantial ground level security guarantees. Like, you have to have something like that in a deal like this, or why would Ukraine would never be incentivized to even entertain such a thing.
No, so I basically agree with Micah that the point of someone like Trump who wanted to drive a hard bargain would have been maximize aid to Ukraine, or at least threaten to do it, even threaten perhaps troops on the ground, and try and drive a bargain where probably I would even say Ukraine might have to give up more territory. So Russia claims 5 territories in eastern Ukraine, Crimea, and then 4 territories on mainland Ukraine. You might just have to give them up in full, even areas that Russia does not currently control, but you get a really strong security guarantee like NATO. That might be the type of bargain you're driving for, because the thing you really don't want to happen, like, to be blunt, territorial integrity, whatever, it's like people aren't living there anymore. There's like 8 people displaced from the region. The sooner the war ends, the sooner they can at least get back to living there on whatever side of the border they prefer. The thing you really need to do is make sure the war does not start again, so people can go back to living in those regions as soon as possible. That means something like NATO guarantees. And I don't think you can get that without driving a hard bargain, and I don't think that's going to happen now. So now Ukraine's not going to have a security guarantee. It is going to lose the territory, and this might happen again 5-10 years down the line.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, I mean, if Ukrainian leadership and Ukrainian people just kind of want to stubbornly fight and, do that indefinitely, again, I mean, that's totally their prerogative, right? I mean, that's totally understandable to some degree. I mean, they come back, like, Ukrainian leadership will come back and they'll say something like, oh, how much of America would you be willing to give up if you were invaded by China or something like that? And it's like, well, Look, I mean, yeah, that's fair enough, right? I mean, I can totally
I don't know.
understand
I
where
would
they're
give up
coming from.
Alaska. I would hand over Alaska.
Yeah,
They can
get
have
rid
it.
of Alaska. But you know, they're learning Chinese in Alaskan schools come 2029.
That's right.
But anyway, but yeah, like that's understandable. That's an understandable sentiment. But you know, there's you know, we recognize that our view is very detached from the situation, right? And that's going to change probably our perspective and our stubbornness on this situation. Um, that's just, you know, realistically, that's the reality of the situation. But what we're saying is more so just look. I mean, what's kind of if we look back in 10 years, you know, what's the most realistic, optimal outcome? Because it sounds like right now we're between basically Ukraine gives up a bunch of territory with no security guarantee from the West and like more feckless EU allyship and membership. Um, or basically they give up some territory, but they at the very least have a more stable kind of security guarantee going forward. Um, and these populations are able to relocate after, you know, this peace deal is signed. They have some assurances that it's safe. I mean, that just on the, you know, on the right hand, that sounds a little bit more realistic and obviously a lot more optimal. Because frankly, without American aid, I don't think the EU has the capability or the desire to fully replace American aid. Their military is not nearly as capable, even though they have a big economy and stuff like that. They don't have nearly the military capability and technology that America does. And I don't know that they'd be willing to actually fully replace the hundreds of billions of dollars that America, you know,
Well,
gives to Ukraine.
I don't know if I agree with this because okay, so we've given 130 billion, or we've given like 115 billion. They given 130 billion, right?
Mhm.
So it's possible for them to replace what we were going to do from now on, right? We've already given a lot. They're super committed right now, like they're completely doubling and tripling down. Because here's what Europe understands: their number one enemy is Russia. That China's not messing with their stuff, and America, no matter how much like we're rude to them, we're not actually coming after them, right?
Well, but
Russia,
Micah, here's my question. You might know more about this than I do, but you might be able to you might be able to like replace the dollars that America or like the dollar value of what America has given to Ukraine. But my understanding is like the EU and like European countries, their actual military capabilities, like the stuff that they would be giving to Ukraine, is just not nearly as good as the stuff that they're getting from America. Um, Now, I don't have a sophisticated view on that. That's just kind of my
I mean, they
layman
could always just
understanding.
buy American weapons and give it to Ukraine, right? I mean,
If the U.S. was willing to sell, but
Right,
I'm
right, yeah.
skeptical the U.S. would be unwilling to just sell it. Our company, I mean, our companies will be willing to sell it. I mean, maybe Trump is so bad that he'll be like, we're not even going to sell you weapons to give it to Ukraine. But
Yeah.
I think that the big problem with that Ukraine struggles with is not maybe a lack of weapons at this point, so much so, but more so that they just don't have very many men. They're running out of people. Like there's just a huge imbalance in like the size of forces, and at a certain point, you don't have any more young men left to fight.
Yeah, the attrition gets really, really tough for Ukraine to deal with as well. I mean, despite the, you know, a defensive war, it's like you can think of it like, you know, war productivity, right? Like, you know, who's going to be able to kill more people per person? Like, well, if you're running a defensive war, probably the guys on the defense are. But you know, it's tough because they're also going to they also want to retake that territory, and they've also had substantial losses. I mean, I think it's in the six figures now. So, you know, Mike is right that it does become, you know, like the demographic imbalance becomes difficult to deal with. Now, Russia has a declining population. And certainly it could be said that, you know, we've seen a lot of news stories of like the Russian kind of frontline having some difficulty with staffing and like with unit discipline as well, because they're relying on conscripts at this point and things like that. But, you know, to the point that Mike is making, you know, the Russian economy and the kind of Russian population as a whole is just bigger, right? It's just bigger. And so it's difficult to say that Russia wouldn't be able to win like a war of attrition in this regard, especially when they seem to have been able to weather at least a significant portion of the storm of the sanctions. I mean, one of the problems with sanctions inherently is that, number one, you're not able to holistically apply them. They still have major allies like India and China and, you know, other countries that are willing to buy their products and, certainly subsidize a lot of their economy and war effort in that sense. But um, you also, they're kind of like a one-time shock to your economy for the most part, where, because they're not holistically applied and because they're not sort of broad-based in nature enough, and because Russia is just that big of a country with that big and diversified of an economy, in a relative sense, that they're able to weather a lot of these things. And it seems like ultimately today the sanctions aren't good for their economy, but they're also not like Russia's not like in perpetual just depression, recession over and over and over again ever since we put in the sanctions, right? Like they're able to produce things and come to war capacity footing in this conflict at this point, and it's hard to imagine that reversing anytime soon. Essie, it looked like you were trying to get in. What were you going to say?
No, I wanted to speak to those real resource constraints on the Ukrainian side. And as well, I do think, sort of contra Micah, that European allies, despite maybe claiming and vocally saying they have a lot of support for Ukraine, I think they're much more constrained by the post-war peace than the United States is, because many countries in Europe are also dependent on trade with Russia, especially for energy resources. So again, there's like another world in a hardball Biden world or whatever, where we subsidize LNG exports to Europe or whatever. We give them an out. We like cut down their energy prices, and that gives them stronger footing to support Ukraine. We go really hard early on. That gets you a better peace deal. But we didn't do any of that, and it's 3 years later. And they are dependent on Russia. And there's a reason, I think, that leaders in Germany seem to be some of the least aggressive in supporting Ukraine, because their country is one of the most dependent on resources from Russia. And you see that all over Eastern Europe. There's just a lot more defense of Russia than there is in Western Europe, which gets more LNG imports from the United States, has nuclear power imports from France, and so on. So I think Ukraine has limited resources, and I don't want to see them squander it, because one possibility is that if you keep doing the war of attrition for another year, 2 years, you do just lose outright. Like, you just lose the ability to maintain a coherent front line. It's not a World War I slow Russian advance anymore. They just win. And that would be like the worst possible outcome. Because not only have you killed way more people, you've lost all the things you hope to get in the peace deal. So I don't know.
Well, I guess we might be circling the drain here. Micah, any last thoughts? And we can kind of summarize our points from there.
I think that Europe has diversified its energy portfolio somewhat. They have learned to cope a bit. I think energy prices are down from their total peaks, and they're importing more LNG, although not enough for the United States. I think the United States can handle its LNG policy optimally. It is true that the United States no longer providing back into Ukraine means that they will receive less shipments of armaments. And it is also true that even if Europe fully backs them to the extent that we've collectively been backing them, it's not like they're going to be gaining ground. They'll just be losing ground pretty slowly. So we need to end the war sooner rather than later. And it's just very unfortunate to me that the peace through strength administration that we live under seems to not care very much about actual strength and not understand that you have to strike a hard bargain to get a lasting peace for Ukraine. They seem completely disinterested in that. And I really hope that the conservatives within the Republican coalition that actually do care about Ukraine, because there's many of them, many of the Republican congressional members were quite pro-Ukraine, can get the Trump administration to come back to the table so we can end this conflict as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, to summarize kind of my main point, I think that unfortunately, I don't really see that kind of fairy tale ending where Ukraine gets their territory back, certainly not anytime soon. And unfortunately, with the current American, just like descriptively speaking, with the current American administration, frankly, I don't see Ukraine getting a good deal at all, right? I mean, I think that Ukraine's probably going to, I hesitate to say that Russia's just going to like conquer all of Ukraine, but like, because that probably won't happen. But like, I think that unfortunately, what you'll probably end up seeing is like a full American withdrawal from the region in terms of aid. You'll probably see the EU kind of try to step in and replace a lot of that. But like Micah said, I mean, that's not really sufficient, right? They're probably just going to lose territory marginally and more slowly over time. This conflict might kind of be protracted for another 2 to 4 years or something like that. But eventually, these real resource constraints, I mean, they just come to a head. Like Micah said, eventually you just lose the people, you lose the manpower or whatever to really prevent Russia from capturing a significantly larger portion of territory. And unfortunately, that probably means like annexation without much security guarantee on the part of Ukraine. And that really sucks. I hope that the lesson that Europe learns from this is kind of twofold. Number one, Europe needs to take its own defense internally much more seriously than it has. Like, Europe needs to spend a lot more money on their individual militaries. I think Macron and other European leaders have called for forming a European army, like a federalized European-wide army, which of course makes a lot of sense. But also, one thing that Europe needs to take very seriously is their economies, right? Their economies have stagnated for pretty much the last decade because of terrible internal economic policy. No, it's not because they have too much welfare spending. It's because, frankly, they have all of these land use restrictions and building restrictions and like all of these things that just like really hold back their ability to invest and spend money productively. And the only way that you're ever going to insulate yourself from the tyrant over in Russia and their hold that you have in your economy on energy and other resources is if you have an independently growing and strong and innovative economy. And so hopefully the EU and European partners take that piece very seriously as well into the future. Because unfortunately, speaking as an American, like if I'm living in Europe, what I'm thinking is we absolutely just can't rely. Like, it's nice whatever help America provides in the future, but we have to think of that as like a bonus, right? We have to have our own industrial capacity. We have to have our own military industrial capacity, because it's clear that we just like absolutely cannot rely on America as being a stable partner in the future as we're going through our own wave of like right-wing populism and that kind of nonsense. STL, final thoughts, and then we'll move on to our audience topic of the week.
Just to mention the economy. So Russia's economy has arguably grown slower due to sanctions, but not much slower. Like it seems to have grown, depending on the metrics you use for PPP and GDP itself, it seems to have grown like over the last 2 years. Ukraine has also grown over the last 2 years, but it's not even back at the level it was pre-war. Like Ukrainians are something like 10, 20% poorer per person than they were before the war started. And so I feel like, again, something that gets sort of sometimes lost in these questions where we're discussing values like defending democracy and so on is that there are hundreds of thousands of men dying. There's millions of people displaced and tens of millions made much poorer by the war ongoing. So that's part of the reason why I'm like, if the war isn't going to resolve any of these values questions, and it's not, it's going to be slow movement for another like 2, 3, 4 years just to gain tiny amounts of territory for Putin, then that's the case for like a peace as soon as possible. If you want people to be prosperous and safe, and ideally Biden should have done it so that we didn't give away the farm and sell out Ukraine. That's basically the position that I've come to. If I want to add one last thing just to this, is that I think a lot of what you're seeing in Trump is, and the US has not been particularly good at upholding this, is a real shift away from international rules-based order. So the United States, in its role in like the Iraq War, in the Gaza War, in many of our Middle Eastern conflicts, has not been upholding international rules-based order, trying to uphold some sort of humanitarian, rights-based, liberal international order. But Trump abandoning even Ukraine, which was sort of the steelman case you could give, that the United States is using its military to support a liberal international order, territorial sovereignty, defensive democracy against a non-democracy. The fact that he's even abandoning that means that I feel like it's very hard to look at US foreign policy and conclude that it's going to be more like pro-liberal, pro-internationalist, pro-rules-based than not in the next decade. It's a really dark time, I think.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Well, anyway, guys, that's our somber analysis on Ukraine and Russia. Unfortunately, it's just a really, really bad situation all around, and American leadership is just woefully unprepared for this moment. Or at the very least, they're actively unwilling to do the good things in this moment, and they're going to do the bad things instead.